So you all know that's happening. And I want to welcome each one of you to this space on Zoom. You all know I'm Ruth Rosell here at the Buttrey Center, and on behalf of Central Seminary and the Buttrey Center for Peace and Nonviolence, I do welcome you and express our delight and gratitude that you've taken time out this evening to be a part of this Zoom series, talking about creation care in a changing climate and doing our part to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Before you get started, I do want to remind you to keep yourself muted so as not to disturb others unless toward the end we have some discussion together. And we are recording this session for viewing later. It will be posted on the Buttrey Center webpage of Central Seminary website and on the Buttrey Center Facebook page. Feel free to put in the chat your name and where you're coming from and whatever else you'd like to share. You also can put in questions that you may have along the way for Josh to address toward the end after he's done his presentation. And that would be helpful to put those in the Q&A. We are going to be a small group, it looks like, so that you also can wait to the end and just bring them up and we can have a discussion at that point as well. Today, we are going to focus on reducing energy use and increasing energy efficiency. This is important for congregations and people of faith, not only because it saves money that can be used for ministry and mission, but because using less energy means producing less greenhouse gas emissions, unless your energy source happens to be 100% clean, which very few churches or homes have. Tonight, we welcome as our guest presenter, Josh Richardson, who is Executive Director and Founder of Brugmansia Ministries, and I hope I'm saying that right. Okay. This nonprofit helps faith communities adapt their buildings and change their ministries to meet the needs created by climate change. Josh holds a Master of Science degree in Geological Sciences from Ohio University and a Master of Arts degree in Public Ministry from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. He is an environmental, big change there, an environmental geologist, ecological thinker, public theologian, and faith leader. As a scientist, Josh has worked in developing technologies in green energy production, nature-based solutions to environmental challenges, and habitat restoration. And as a public religious figure, Josh does public speaking, preaching, writing, and leading workshops. Because he approaches climate challenges with both scientific and theological understandings, Josh is creative in developing solutions, and his writings also indicate a strong commitment to climate justice. After Josh has shared some of his thoughts with us, there'll be time for you to ask questions as you consider how you and your faith communities can reduce your greenhouse gases and meet the challenges of climate change. So Josh, now I'm going to turn this time over to you, and we are so glad that you're able to join us in the Zoom space, and we look forward to what you are going to share with us.
Great. Thank you so much for the incredibly warm welcome. It's a joy to be with you all. And I get to talk about something that I love talking about. So that's an absolute joy, which is energy efficiency. I'm going to give about a 30 to 35, 40-minute presentation. The way that I've designed this talk is to really empower you. So most of us, I'm assuming, are already in this movement and are already working and have a lot of thoughts and ideas. And so the way that I've designed this is to really give talking points and frameworks to help you get to the next step with your community, right? So it's not a basic talk in the sense of this is what energy efficiency is, but it's how do we leverage what we're doing, and how do we think about who we need to talk to? What are some facts and statistics that will help us communicate better? And so that's really the framework. And so feel free to ask questions as we go along. We're a small group, and so I don't mind being interrupted. I prefer a dialogue instead of me just talking to people. But anyway, we will go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, or as Ruth mentioned, my name is Josh. I'm the Executive Director of Brugmansia Ministries. I'm also the pastor of St. Louis Mennonite Fellowship. And so I come at this problem both in both directions, understanding. And for the past few years, I've been working with Tennessee Interfaith Light to develop a climate resilience and cool congregations program where we've been doing energy efficiency work and also climate resilience work. And some of the projects that we have sort of in the works are large scale geothermal heat pumps, solar panels, things like windows. We do a lot of energy evaluation and stuff like that. And so that work has been going really well in Tennessee. But I got here through an unconventional route. So I started out my career as a geologist, and I studied geothermal energy in Appalachia, looking at repurposing abandoned mines for geothermal heating and cooling. And then I worked for the Illinois State Geological Survey. I did wetland remediation and research on chemical movements in wetlands. And I became sick. And so I was diagnosed with cancer. And I was unable to be a geologist. So I've switched to working in the religious sphere. And in there, I've done large scale sustainability work at Garrett Evangelical, where I was a part of the team that got us certified as a Green Seminary with the Green Seminary Initiative. And I've been working with various faith communities now across the country on measures of energy efficiency and climate resilience. So I want to start with a question for us to sort of think about. So what information do we actually need to successfully advocate for energy efficiency in our houses of worship or in our homes, right? If we have to convince someone else where we're living, what information do we actually need to be convincing? And then with that, and I know there's been a lot of work with the other series that I would check out that the Buttrey Center's done, but what biblical story makes sense for this particular moment in the history of life on this planet regarding climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecological degradation? So who do we see ourselves in the biblical story? So I'm going to argue that our best sort of analogy as managers and thinkers is Joseph in Egypt. So Joseph is placed in Egypt. He's basically, Pharaoh has dreams about ecological destruction. Joseph's given a managerial role and has to sort of shepherd resources and collect resources to prepare for a coming famine. And so we need to be thinking about wise use of our current resources when we still have relative abundance. We need to have future-oriented thought, just like Joseph did. So let's not spend our resources now, but let's think about how to maximize. We have to work within existing power structures. So just like Joseph had to work in Egypt, we have limitations with where we're working. And so we have to really think about how our organizations are structured and understand our barriers. And we have to prepare then for the future challenges of climate change, which I'll touch on briefly. This isn't a climate talk. We'll sort of talk a little bit about climate change. So what are some of the big global challenges that we're seeing? This isn't just climate change, but this is general environmental degradation. The Stockholm Resilience Center has done some work looking at what they're calling planetary boundaries. These are areas in which humans are in balance with the planet, and if these things become out of balance, we can fundamentally change Earth systems. And so right now, they've noted that we're outside of a safe operating range for 6 out of the 9 identified planetary boundaries. So climate change is one of those boundaries, but this is also things like biodiversity loss, our changes to landform and land systems, our freshwater usage is out of balance, and things like our nitrogen and phosphorus production for agriculture. And so how that affects sort of different chemical systems. And things that we're sort of in balance with, like pushing, are things that you've probably heard of, like ocean acidification, which is sort of tied into carbon dioxide production. And more near term, we're looking at certain challenges with climate tipping points. So these are Earth systems that, if changed, will be permanently changed. We won't be able to change back. And those are generally, when we think of those, they're associated with temperature shifts. So right now, there are a number of climate tipping points. We think about changes to the Amazon rainforest, where it's started to become a producer of carbon dioxide instead of a carbon sink. Things like our ice sheets melting. And so if we're unable to control our temperature production, then we're going to cross tipping points, and there will be foundational changes to Earth systems that will have huge implications for agriculture, for biologic life on this planet. And just as a note, there's a recent publication that came out that suggests we may cross the 1.5 degree threshold briefly this year. And certainly we're expecting that this decade. And so there's a real possibility that we're going to cross some of these very foundational geologic boundaries. We're going to see changes to Earth systems that are irreversible. And this is sort of the hard news in the room. So we're still producing more and more carbon emissions. We haven't actually reduced. 2023 is going to be a record year, more than likely. And so we're still moving in the wrong direction. And so even though we are investing in a lot of things like solar panels and wind and different forms of nuclear energy and hydrogen and things like that, we're still producing more CO2 globally. And so we really need to think about how do we reduce. This is where energy efficiency becomes so absolutely important. And again, talking about our solar and our renewables, there are real challenges to transitions. And so there are challenges with mining and what that looks like, the scale of mining needed and the suffering of mining, challenges in sourcing. And so, where are we getting materials from and what people are being sort of asked to do that? And is that ethical? Also just raw availability. So the scale that we need to transition, so you're going to see supply chain issues and can we actually do this in timescales? And so we really need to reposition ourselves and rethink about these things. So this is where, again, thinking about energy efficiency as a way to reduce our CO2 without needing to produce as many materials. And so that's why this becomes such an important conversation. So I'm briefly going to touch on what climate change looks like for communities and what are we really looking at. So even if we hit the Paris Accord agreements, we're probably looking at 3 degrees. That's probably, recent calculations have Paris. So if we meet those commitments, which we're not on track to hit, that's 3 degrees. We understand that climate change is connected to affluence, right? So the driver is not simply CO2 production, but it's actually consumption. And there's good data to support that. We know we're looking at near-term and short-term impacts. So, we're talking about catastrophic impacts within all of our lifetimes now. For a long time, we've been talking about far-off impacts, and that's not the case. And we're already starting to see some catastrophic impacts. We've already committed ourselves to a large number of emissions. And this is something that we're going to have to really think about, especially as faith communities. So if we just let our systems that we've built go to their lifetime, we're going to overshoot our emissions goals. So when you think about, we buy an HVAC system and we say that has a 20-year lifespan, right? That's that lifetime of that piece of equipment. And so if we just let our equipment go to their lifespans and what we've planned for, we're not going to hit our targets. And so we might need to actually think about decommissioning things that we think are within their lifespan. And so that's a difficult conversation for faith communities, especially. And I know you all are dealing with this in Missouri and Kansas. We're seeing crop shortages. This has implications for finances and inflation, as well as just general community health and hunger. We're seeing crises with blackouts. In St. Louis, I gave a talk in St. Louis, so I have this up here. We're dealing with flooding, and then pricing increases. And again, for faith communities, when we're thinking about pricing, this becomes a real challenge. So how do we sort of see through what can we afford? And what does energy fluctuation mean? So when we're thinking about climate change and we're talking to people about climate change, we can understand it as 3 basic types of impacts. We have baseline and chronic impacts. These are things like our agricultural declines, our increased prices, migration and climate gentrification, medical demand. These are our community impacts. Then we have our punctuated impacts, which we talk about more in the media. And so these are things like floods, our droughts, our famines. These are more the catastrophic things. And then we have transitional impacts. And so these are things like mining, community and economic loss from transitioning from one energy source to another, local disease and pollution, impacts of recycling and these sort of things. And so we need to be considering all of these things. And honestly, when we're thinking about energy efficiency, we're trying to reduce everything, right? So we're really trying to pull down and solve all of these problems by basically not consuming as many resources. So I thought I would, just for you all who are watching this at the Buttrey Center, give you a little bit of information on what you're looking at for climate change for your community. So it's projected that 10% of the properties in Shawnee have a 26% chance of flooding within the next 30 years from changes in rainfall patterns. About 43 days a year by 2050 are going to be over 100, and 87 above 90. And so the projected increase for energy usage in Shawnee is about 13.8% by 2050 to cover that air conditioning load. And so when we're thinking about our buildings, that has major implications for our budget. It also has major implications for our grid stability. So again, coming back to energy efficiency, we need to be thinking about how do we lower our energy efficiency so we can simply afford to keep running. And then just to throw some numbers on our energy markets. So this past year, there's only been a 3.7 increase in consumer prices. But the year before that, energy increased by 41%. And so I know, when we do our budget, at our church, we're going to do maybe a 3 or 4% assumption on our utility increases, but those energy prices jumped 40% in a year. And that was largely due to volatility with Russia and Ukraine and that. But that's something we were expecting to continue to see volatility in our energy markets. And as we see inflation, we see decreased donations. And so there's financial pressure on both ends for us. And so we really need to be smart financially. And then sort of a newer thing that I've been seeing is increased insurance rates with natural disasters. So for our faith communities, we're paying more just to run. And so again, we need to think about how do we reduce the amount that we're paying to go, because we're having all of these auxiliary charges. And this is sort of a more of a meta understanding of climate change. So our red line on the right is where Kansas City is projected their analogous climate today by 2080. And so Kansas City, we're looking at close to Dallas, is if you sort of average the climate projections. And on the right is the map of bioregion. And so this is something we need to be thinking about. And so, our cities are going to be moving to different bioregions. And so all of the plants and the animals and the buildings and the way that we've designed things aren't actually designed for the climate we're entering. Right. And so we're really entering a new space and a new world where our infrastructure doesn't make sense, and our plants and our animals and all of our non-living siblings are really not adapted to that life. And so there's a lot of uncertainty there. And so again, we need to do everything we can to reduce these impacts and to stop this, because it's really potentially catastrophic. So now I'm going to shift to the bulk of what we're talking about, which is energy efficiency, and I'll throw a little bit in on climate resilience. So general benefits for reducing energy in your building. We're reducing the amount of resources consumed by our buildings. We're lowering our financial overhead to run our buildings. We're lowering our maintenance costs. We're increasing our property values. We're increasing the mental well-being for our staff and our congregants. So green buildings have a proven mental benefit. And we're becoming more resilient to the impacts of climate change. We should have more money for missional outreach, or at least we're going to be able to absorb financial shocks a little bit better. And we're going to be able to decrease the amount of suffering in resource consumption. So we're reducing mining impacts and the suffering that we're creating for others by our consumption. So I'm going to briefly touch on some of the financial estimates. So the United States Green Building Council estimates that for energy efficiency measures, generally about a 19.2% return on investment for old buildings, and about 10% for new buildings. So there's a serious financial benefit to investing in energy efficiency. Green buildings reduce maintenance costs by about 20%. They increase our property value by about 10%. We can increase our rental value. And now when we're thinking about resilience, for every $1 spent on resilience is $6 saved in natural disaster repairs. So investing in things like flood mitigation is way cheaper than fixing flood damage. And so it really makes a lot of sense to be thinking, forward thinking to the way that our world is changing. So what programs would your faith community implement or support if you could spend 20% less on your building, right? For some of our communities, this is a significant amount of money that can go right into our communities and right into outreach. And so we can help people as they're struggling with things like inflation if we can reduce our overall costs. So now I'm going to run through the basics of how to think about actually getting to the point where we're actually reducing energy. So these are the basics of sustainability. There are a lot of great programs that can walk you through this. The Green Building Council does LEED certification. You've probably seen that. Energy Star is the EPA. US EPA does Energy Star, and they rate appliances. They also have a lot of great information there. There's also a really cool organization that I like to highlight called Living Building Challenge. It's an architectural group, and they're working with folks to get buildings to the point where they are self-sustaining for that 72 hours after a natural disaster. So basically, you work to get the building to the point where it can survive on its own and help support the community after a natural disaster. So we want to start by simply understanding our building. So doing an energy audit, evaluate our energy consumption through our utility bills, do site walkthroughs. There are great organizations that help with this. Interfaith Power and Light does a lot of that work. And I think there's a good chapter in Kansas that can probably help with that. And then private contractors as well, or your energy company. And so here's an example of some work that my organization did for Tennessee Interfaith Power and Light, looking at energy reduction in a smaller church. So they replaced their heater in 2018 and put in some programmable thermostats. And they reduced their CO2 production from gas by about 30%. And they were saving around $600 a year. And then, when they had the giant price increase, about 40%, they didn't see any savings, but they actually budget stayed about baseline from where it was previously. So they're still sort of seeing that savings built in, not to where you'd hope, but sort of in a more resilient way. And so the first thing you want to do is really understand how you're using energy, how much you're spending, and get a good understanding of that. And then we can actually look at where we make changes. So these are the categories for building usage and changes that we can think about. So human interaction and behavior, electrical energy, our HVAC system, so heating and cooling, water, the envelope or the shell, this is the walls, the windows, the roof, and then the grounds as well, is something we want to think about. So human behavior, we can save up to 30% of a building's energy by simply changing the way that we use our buildings on average. Things like setting our computers to sleep at night, right? So having that be a mandatory automated shutoff and sleep saves a massive amount of energy. Most people don't put their computers to sleep and they let them run all night. And so depending on how many computers you're running, or especially for something like a seminary or a larger organization, this can have a massive savings in energy. Unplugging unused appliances. So going through your building and making sure that things that don't need to be plugged in aren't plugged in. Turning things off. Keeping unnecessary lights off. Keeping outdoor doors closed when they don't need to be closed. So if it's in the summer, we don't need to have our doors open and all of our energy going out the door. And just conscientious decision making. So 30%. So that's absolutely huge, just by human behavior. So a couple of things that we can do to think about electrical consumption. So switching from incandescent bulbs to LED bulbs uses about 75 less amount of electricity per bulb, right? So you're using way less electricity. And I've worked with some churches where the break-even point is less than a year. So they're making money within the same fiscal year on switching from incandescents to LEDs based on their setup. So it makes a lot of sense to do that. You can get grants and things like that a lot of times for things like that. Motion sensor lights can save 30% on the energy used. Our energy efficiency appliances. So our Energy Star rated kitchen appliances have a return on investment of about 10 to 20% when you're replacing older appliances. And then switching from desktops to laptops. Saves a lot of energy, and honestly, it makes a lot of sense for the way that people are working now in a hybrid environment, right? So laptops use about 50 to 80% less energy compared to a desktop. And so if you think about how we can sort of move to a multimodal work system, but then also save energy in that process. Our HVAC systems are major sources of consumption, also major potential savings. So to start, if you're not running programmable thermostats, or smart thermostats are a little bit better than the programmable ones where they learn the building usage, it's something to really think about. So you can reduce your heating costs by about 10%, 10 to 12%, and cooling by about 15%. For larger buildings, you think about installing zone cooling. So you can put dampers into your ducts, and you can zone your building. And so you can not heat and cool areas that aren't used regularly. So for faith communities, this becomes especially important because a lot of times we have entire wings of buildings that we don't use except for maybe 2 days a week, right? And so we don't need to be putting energy in. So we can reduce our cost by up to 30% by being strategic about where we're allowing our energy to go within a building. Insulation is really important. And then we can upgrade our HVAC systems. So ground source heat pumps are really, really efficient. And I'll talk about it a little bit later, but there's federal funding right now for those. And so you can, basically cut your heating and cooling by about 50 to 70% with a ground source heat pump compared to conventional HVAC system. Air source heat pumps are also really efficient. They're a little less efficient, but that might be another option if you're not in the position to do a ground source heat pump. And then thinking about water as well. So how do we reduce the amount of water we're consuming? This is going to become continually more important, especially for our friends out west. And so low flow and energy efficiency toilets, we can use 20% less on that toilet. Our aerators that we put on our faucets are really important. So you're using half a gallon per minute compared to 5 gallons per minute was the old standard. So if we don't have our aerators on our faucets, our touch-free faucets reduce water usage by about 60 to 80%. Just the amount of time that they're on and not allowing that run. And then we can think about gray water systems. There are advantages and disadvantages, but this is basically reusing some water to integrate with toilets or with gardens and things like that. And it's a recycling method that is something that in an area where water shortages are sort of an important consideration, that gray water becomes a really advantageous way to approach that. And so finally, we're going to talk about, well, not finally, we're going to talk about the last building part, which is our envelope and our shell, so our walls and our windows and things like that. So insulation has a return on investment of around 100%. So you're getting basically $2 for every dollar you invest in insulation in a well-insulated building and making sure that your building's thermally stable. Efficient windows are really, really important. For our faith communities, thinking about curtains and thermal curtains, they're also light reflectors. So you can put, light reflecting materials on the outside windows as well. But we can reduce our loss through those windows. General weatherization is really important. We can think about green roofing. And so this is planting on our roofs. This is a way to create insulation. And also things like living walls. So putting plants on our walls, plants act as great insulators as well. So it's a way to make the space, more pleasant, but also a way to increase our insulation. And finally, we don't talk about this a lot in energy efficiency, but it's really important, which is our grounds and our parking lots. So how do we reduce our lawns, and do we need our lawns? And so you can put in things like regenerative agriculture for food production. You're not spending the gasoline to mow a lawn and upkeep. You're not having to put as much water in if you use native plants. And something that's increasingly important in cities as we're dealing with heat island effect, and that's projected to be worse, is microclimate formation. So we can strategically put trees in around a building to reduce our energy usage for that building. And so it's really thinking about how do we partner with the natural systems to reduce our energy in ways that make sense, that sort of co-create good environments that support life and biodiversity on our outside, but also help us reduce energy on the inside. And so I'm going to throw in permeable pavement as just flood reduction. It's not an energy efficiency measure, but increasingly as we're seeing a lot of flooding, this is something that is really important, and there's often money for stuff like that in communities that's available. So some funding. So how do we actually pay for our energy efficiency measure? We have all these great ideas, right? We're gonna go and we're gonna put in our insulation, and we're going to change our light systems, and we're gonna get a ground source heat pump. And there is funding for these things. And so there's the Department of Energy has the Renew America program. They just announced their prime recipients. They've put $45 million in across the country for energy efficiency programs for nonprofits, including faith communities. How that money is going to get distributed, we'll see. And you might want to look up who your prime recipient is in your region. In the Kansas City area, it's the Mid-American Regional Council, are the folks that are going to be sort of doling out those funds and picking the projects who are receiving there. The Inflation Reduction Act, this is for renewable energies and storage. For faith communities, they're doing up to 30% direct payments for solar, wind, energy storage, and geothermal heat pumps. So they'll pay up to I think it's $200,000 or 30%, whichever is less, for a geothermal system. Now, the geothermal systems aren't $600,000, thankfully, but that's the cap that they'll have. And so, so you can get a 30% payment from the government. So they'll actually give you the money. And so it's how we can actually, as faith communities, get that because we're not paying taxes. Often there are denominational resources on larger and smaller scales. So various small grants from energy or from climate groups and environmental denominational groups. The Episcopal Church has a number of good grants. I think the Baptist Church probably does as well. Interfaith Power and Light has a great spreadsheet where they're collecting all of the federal funding sources. So you can go and you can click on their spreadsheet and you can look at where funding is on the federal level. And honestly, Interfaith Power and Light's a really good resource typically for local funding. And so talking to them about local funding resources, because there's often a number of small nonprofits or small foundations that have money for these sort of things that you can get, but it's just knowing how to access that. And also something not to forget is the electric company. And so more and more our electric companies are putting money in for these sort of things because it's helping them keep their grid stable. And so energy efficiency is becoming more and more important. I know in Tennessee, working with TVA, homeowners can get free energy audits, right? And so you can at least get the first step done by the electric company, right? They're really interested in these things. And when I was in Chicago in ComEd, ComEd would pay for LED installation, right? And so they would switch over people's bulbs for free. And so really understanding what your electric company does and what they're willing to do is really important because you might be able to get a lot of this done sort of with the help of your electric company. So I'm going to briefly end with what my organization does, which is climate resilience. And so we're sort of thinking about the impacts and how do we understand those things. So what we're doing is we're combining climate projections and community infrastructure and thinking about how we adjust our buildings to meet those needs. So it's how do we use our buildings to meet current and future needs, and we're considering our projections, and then we understand how our communities are vulnerable to changes in climate change. So things like hunger from inflation, things like flooding, and things like climate gentrification and need for housing. So how do we actually adapt our church buildings for that? I'm going to take actionable steps towards that work. And so here's just some general sort of maps and ways that we think about it. So, we're looking at things like food deserts by census tract. And so we did some work in Mobile. And then we're looking at, because in our Bay Area on the ocean, we're looking at ocean level rise. So thinking about, what people are going to have access to food in a hurricane, right? As flooding comes and floods that bay. And so working with the community there to think through food production and housing. And honestly, because they have a lot of people in hurricane situations that are running around without shelter. And so this is sort of where we're at. And so here's some examples of resilience measures your community could take. And so electrical battery backups with solar power. This is becoming increasingly common in California and on the West Coast with wildfires. I think we'll continue to see that more in areas like Texas and the Southeast as grids can't handle the energy loads from heat. And so this is a way that faith communities are providing things like power for dialysis machines. So that folks can basically run their dialysis, right, when the grid fails. We see a lot of food production on roofs and green roofing. This insulates our roofs, but it's also providing food for our communities. Rain gardens are reducing flooding. Permaculture, again, we're reducing flooding. We're reducing our landscape maintenance, and we're providing food for our community. We're starting to see water filtration and water providing, so storage of water. So places like Jackson, Mississippi. So flooding is knocking out water sources. So we saw that this past year in Jackson. We've also seen it in Philadelphia. And so faith communities can start thinking through water filtration and how do we provide clean water for folks when they need it. And then supplies for displacement, emergency shelters, and increasingly, in places like Shawnee and things like this, when you have more than a month of a year is going to be over 100 degrees, things like becoming a cooling station become really vital for a community sort of survival. And so this is our our thought process. This is our model of social change, where we want to take a community from abstract thought of climate change to concrete action. Right. So how do we go from climate change to our actual actionable plan? And so what we do with communities is we look at what is climate change, what does that mean, and then we look at what are the climate impacts that we talked about versus and combine that with their community assets and their vulnerabilities. So where do you get your water? What are your social vulnerabilities? How many people, what are your housing markets, things like that? What are the migration projections? And so we can sort of get a picture of what future needs may look like with climate impacts. And as we identify our community needs, and then we can come up with tangible solutions. And so that's really our goal, is to come up with solutions, thinking like Joseph. So how do we meet the needs of the future now by acting today? And then, work with them to get an actual plan together. So let's get timelines. Let's have an action plan to change our infrastructure. So thank you. It's been a real joy. I want to, feel free to contact me. This is my email. I also want to note that we're supported proudly by the American Baptist Home Mission Society as well. And so they're one of our funders that we really work with, and I want to highlight that, working with the Buttrey Center. So thank you so much, and I'll open up time for questions.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was wonderful, just packed full of information and your experience, which is just very, very broad. Now is the time we have that we can talk with one another, ask whatever questions you may have that you'd like to bring up with Josh. There aren't any in the Q&A, so just feel free to, if you raise your hand, then I can call on you or unmute and speak up if you want to do it that way. But what questions do you have for Josh? Pasbe, you have a question?
Yeah. So he was talking, when you're talking about how we use the is it the heat to our home, like the computer or the gas, all those kind of thing, like our house can reduce and then increase the bill. And what about, like, the outlay we always plug in? Does that count? Or
so let me, I want to mirror back what I'm hearing, because I'm so yeah, I mean, the goal is basically any energy that we're reducing is going to reduce our bill, right? So unplugging things, it's going to reduce our bill, but it's also going to reduce the amount of resources we're just using in general. And so, thinking really smartly about these things, you can really affect, part of some of our foundational challenges. So one of the foundational challenges that isn't often talked about climate change is the cost, right? And so there are real financial challenges, both to actually change what we're doing, but also if we don't change, we know that financially this is going to become very expensive for people to just live and make changes. And so, I think it's sort of working on that double level that's really important, and to understand that.
okay, so I just want to let you know that my house is very old, and then we got very huge bill like every winter time, every summertime. The thing is that our house, like ever since we bought it, it doesn't have an energy system. We never pay the energy. We never pay the energy. It's only for the LES. So in that case, if we have an energy, if we set out one, that would be helpful. Or
Yeah, I mean, so if you're working in an old building with huge energy bills, I think, starting with an audit, see if you can get, a local professional who works in your region and knows and can walk through and talk to you about, because there are a lot of different ways you could be losing your energy, right? So with old buildings, especially, our windows are often a really big problem. So we have older, single pane window systems are really challenging, or insulation's not very good. And so, maybe thinking about those sort of questions, and even breaking down, is your energy bill really expensive because your heating and cooling is expensive, or is it your amount of energy, electricity you're consuming, right? And so I would talk to someone, but I would really think and try to figure out where you're using a lot of energy. And then, because older buildings are hard, they're really a challenge, and they can be really expensive. I mean, one of the challenges I ran into, so I was working at the seminary, and we were designated as a historic building. And so we had to go and fight the city on regulations to allow us to make changes because of that designation, right? And so these are, it's really complex often, and it's not necessarily easy. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Were there others? Day, were you raising your hand? Yeah.
Thank you for that presentation. It's very helpful and very informative. I was curious about permeable concrete.
Mm-hmm.
Tonight was the first time I've been exposed to that technology. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So there are permeable surfaces, and there are a whole bunch of different kinds and ways to do it. Sometimes it's with tiling where there's cracks in between, so basically there's little gaps. Sometimes it's a special sort of surface that allows water to flow through it faster. And so what it does is it allows water to go through the concrete and then infiltrate into the ground instead of hitting the concrete and running off into our sewer systems. And so our flooding, in our cities often is because our sewer systems become overloaded with too much water too quickly. And so basically by creating a permeable concrete system, that water then isn't going into your sewer and contributing to that problem. And so it's a really good way to reduce flood risk. Yeah. And there are a whole bunch of different ones that you can think through.
So this is something that you could actually pave a parking lot or a driveway.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
I have a question about energy audits. They are not offered by our energy company, and just wondered, how do you go about finding someone who specializes in church buildings, is going to give you a fair price, is going to be really good to work with churches who may not be super knowledgeable in engineering and those kinds of things? Do you have any suggestions about how to go about that?
Yeah, I do. So, I mean, the first thing is there's a lot of resources, and if you want, you can email me. I can send you some where you can do your own walkthroughs and things.
Okay.
And those exist, and they're pretty okay. But I think, so what state are you in?
Kansas.
Kansas. So I think Interfaith Power and Light should be pretty good. And you should be able to talk to them, and they might know contractors at least.
We currently don't have an active IPL in Kansas.
Is the IPL? Oh, they're not running in Kansas anymore.
Well, it's connected with Kansas Interfaith Action, but it's just getting started again. So it hasn't really been established.
Yeah. So yes. So email me. I'll send you some resources, and I'll also see who I might know. But yeah, your best route then might be the energy company. Because they often have, depending, it might just be in Kansas, that's not possible. But yeah, depending on who they are. And there might be, there are a lot of different networks. And so email me and I'll think about it. But like the Methodist Church, the UMC has a lot of different networks and folks too that do this sort of stuff. And so it's, there are people out there. It's just sometimes, yeah, you're right. It's hard to find reputable people.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Noni, we haven't used them, but Cromwell Solar we used.
Yeah, he spoke on this, didn't he? Yeah,
he spoke on Rooftop Solar. We use them for our solar system, but I do notice on their website that they also do energy audits. So they're out of Lawrence, but they operate in the area. So you might check that out and then let me know. But sure. They've been reputable they've been a good organization to work with for us.
Okay, thank you.
Jerry, you've got your hand up.
Yes.
Oh, Jerry, you just muted.
Oh, you just muted yourself.
Yeah.
There.
Back on permeable pavement, it occurs to me that another problem with pavement, whether it's blacktop or concrete or even tile, is that it traps heat, which reflects back onto the building. So I would think the color would matter, and if you really wanted to do it cheaply, you could probably use gravel, white gravel, which would be very permeable and be less likely to trap heat. You could even plant grass on some kind of green vegetation on the gravel, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on pavement. So yeah. I think that's probably right, but I also think there are a lot of considerations depending on what type of building and usage and code too. Yeah.
So I'm wondering what your experience has been, Josh. I know that a lot of churches or faith communities, they are, they've been very, they're busy with their ministries and just kind of maintaining everything that they can do. And so to think about doing any of this, just to think of their whole old building and trying to upgrade it when they have limited resources and time may feel a little bit overwhelming. I wonder what you could say from your experience working with churches. I think you have quite a number of churches you're working with. What you might say, I mean, you've already given a lot of good reasons, but what practical suggestions do you have to help congregations, or have you been able to help congregations really embrace this? And if there's like either members or pastors of congregations here, do you have any further thoughts about that would help people or congregations be able to embrace this kind of a project? Because you're right, because like it's so potentially helpful to do this, and yet so many are not doing it either.
So I'll give a couple different answers. I'll give my one cynical answer, which is climate change is the #1 issue that young people care about in this country, in the United States. So if you want to have a faith community that's actually speaking to the younger generations, this is a really tangible way to make that known that you actually understand the things that they care about. And I think that's really important, right? To see it as, I think from my own perspective, I think often faith communities, we haven't done a great job of making ourselves relevant in the ways that matter to younger generations. And I think this is something that's really important. So that would be one way. I think, it's my sense that, this work brings about a lot of hope. That's really, really important. So you're actually having agency to do something in your community to make the world better and more positive, right? And so we're shifting from telling people about hope to actually actively engaging in hope. And so, for me, so I'll talk about my work as a pastor and what I'm working with my own community. So, we're working and we're figuring out how to become an urban garden and an urban farm. And St. Louis is really struggling. And so thinking about how to put hydroponics in our basement and convert our lawn to permaculture, that we can have food forests that people can just come and take food freely. And, for me, what is amazing about this work is how exciting it is to have a vision that meets community needs in a very tangible way. And so even if it's just turning off the lights, being able to tell that story of saying, if we all use our lights and our power grid goes down, there are people that they're going to die, right? They're actually not going to survive this, right? And so even our simple actions, really do a lot of good in this world. And I think it's a story that we need to be telling because it's true. And I think that's my best, realistic for faith communities. And when they get there, they see it, right? So a lot of the communities that we work with, once they get going and they start on this path, they see the benefits financially, but they also see the possibilities, right? And so they're really seeing these ministries blossom in really interesting and helpful ways.
I've also heard it's kind of helpful to start small
Yeah.
and then keep track of the savings and then use the savings for the next step, and try to build in that way that small successes maybe can lead to larger ones. Now, the really big, I think the huge utility or the huge cost and energy usage is the HVAC system in churches. And I think about our church has a great big old boiler down in the basement. Unfortunately, it cracked and then they put in a new one. But and therefore the need to kind of be ready for when those things happen. But I'm also curious if you've worked with churches in that transition. Churches, they have these big old systems, and how has it gone to, I'm very unfamiliar with the geothermal. I'm more familiar with the air heat pump. How has it gone for them to try to make that transition? Do you have any experience or thought about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of really good examples of this. I think there's a lot of initial fear, right? And I think that's something we have to really be cognizant of, right? And there's also an understanding that the people often who are doing the buildings and grounds work by nature have to be really conservative, right? Not conservative politically, but realistically, their job is really, really hard, right? Because if things go out of whack and then pricing is really bad, they feel like they're responsible for the well-being of the entire organization in the church. And so I think there's a lot of, and so for these big projects, especially like HVACs or even solar panels that have a huge initial financial outlay, where I've seen it be successful is when the whole congregation understands it and really is on board and is empowered to do it, and really takes that burden off of the building person to make that decision alone. Or, when the pastor says, this isn't my world, you just do what's best for the building or whatever. I think that's really hard. And so when it's worked well, and what I've seen when worked well is really when the entire community really understands it and has adopted these principles. And then I think the transitions do work well. But yeah, it's a really important question. And it's a really hard question.
Thank you. That's helpful. Any other questions that stay?
I hate to jump in twice if anybody else has a question, and this may be unanswerable in the time we have left, but when you encounter climate change deniers in the work that you do, how do you address that?
So I'll answer this in two parts. So at this point, at least if we're talking about the United States, there are very few people that actually deny climate change now. So it's something like 80% of our general population believes in climate change as a general principle. We're seeing too many effects for most people. Now, where there's a real disconnect and where this is challenging is most people don't believe it affects them as much as it does, or will affect them as much as it does. And so there's an implicit denial. So, in the beginning of my talk where I'm talking about planetary boundaries and I'm talking about tipping points, that's where the scientific community is at, and we understand things, but that's pretty catastrophic compared to the daily lived expectations for most people in our country. So for people that completely deny climate change is happening, I'll try to highlight financial benefits, and I'll try to talk to them about, doing good things for their community, or even something like aesthetics. But I'm not gonna, when we're watching California on fire every year and heat waves are destroying everything and our crops are dying, I'm not going to spend a lot of my time arguing those basic things. I think, that's not actually healthy for me. It's not healthy for that person. Right. Now, where I think there is a real sense that we need to grow on is what climate change actually looks like for our communities. And there's a lot of denial within our own movement of how bad this is going to be. And so thinking about crop projections, are really difficult, right? And seeing inflation not simply as corporate greed, but as climate change and crop failures, or as regions becoming too hot so they can't produce fundamental goods, and that's why we're seeing supply chain disruptions. And so that's a harder conversation that I sort of, I agree. We need to motivate the 70 to 80%. Yeah, I think that's it. And so that's the hard conversation for me is, we'll say, look, because really I'm talking about all these energy efficiency things, but we've got to get beyond the, simply the LEDs, right? We have to get to the whole being change of, we need to radically change our transportation systems. We need to radically change our food systems. We need to radically change how we see our relationship to the animals and the plants around us. And sort of this, where we're at in that conversation is not as strong.
One last comment or question, or have we come to the end? Well, I want to say thank you so much, Josh, for this time together. Very, very helpful, very time. And sharing your knowledge, your experience has been wonderful. And thanks to each one of all of you for zooming in and spending the time this evening as well, talking about a subject that's kind of hard when you talk about climate change, but also hopeful. As Josh has pointed out, there's a lot we can do to reduce energy use, and that is directly doing good for our world whenever we do that. So thank you. I want to remind you, in 2 weeks, we will be having the last and 5th part of this series on November 15th at the same time. And it'll be on moving toward a plant-based diet and other lifestyle choices. So just to let you know, I'm going to be the presenter for that. And I'm not going to say everybody has to cut out all their meat, okay? One doesn't have to cut out meat entirely to be moving toward a plant-based diet. And surprisingly, perhaps, if many of us took some steps in that direction, it could have a significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So we're going to talk about why our diet choices are important, how to get started, and maybe making some changes, as well as touch on a number of other important lifestyle choices that can make a difference. So I do hope that you will join us again in a couple of weeks and be a part of that conversation. But again, thanks to each of you. Thank you, Josh, so much for your expertise and your time, and good night to each one of you.